Okay, so what you're going to see over the next whatever couple of videos is a series of videos on a couple of different types of decisions that you can make or that are made in the short term. So I'm in your textbook on page 393. A couple of decisions that you can make in the short term. The first one we're going to look at is make or buy. And we also use this idea of marginal costing when we talk about should we take on additional work. Now, again, you can't make these type of decisions. I'll keep saying that. You can't really make these type of decisions at the beginning of your business. I've said this before. Typically, right? Even this idea of additional work. A business needs to break even, so they must think of their fixed costs. But once they've broken even, then you can start to make these type of decisions. So that's the traditional theory. In your first year, that's pretty much enough, but you can grow that. But the key point is, that's the key point. Okay, so the first thing we're going to look at is make or buy. And when we talk about make or buy, do we make a component or do we buy it into our factory? Now, the fact here is you must remember that when you're making a product will have material costs, direct material, some direct labor, and then there will be some fixed costs, some fixed overheads that it will also have to pay for. And very much at the beginning of when you're making a product, you're trying to break even, so you think of all these costs. Right. So let's have a scenario. You can have a scenario where at the beginning of the year, you might be deciding, do we make product in-house or do we buy the actual product? Now, if you're making this type of long-term decision, yes, if you're thinking, actually, I think we want to actually make a product, you're going to have to get a warehouse. If you're at the beginning of the year and you're trying to decide whether to make or buy a product, then yes, you have to think about the long-term implications, including the fixed costs of setting everything up. And that's true. Yes, or do you just buy the product in? If you choose to just buy the product in, then you don't need a warehouse. You don't have to think about the fixed costs. You can just focus on just buying, if you like, the product in. So this make or buy thing actually has, like I say, two scenarios. If you're really at the beginning of the year, then you'll be thinking about, well, of course you'll have to think, I'm just making the product, and I have to think about the fixed costs, of course, because we're at the beginning of the year. So, of course, this will affect whether do we expand and buy some rent on new premises or get a new machine. And these are all the sorts of things you have to think if you're thinking at the beginning of the year. So definitely, this option, of course, will definitely affect fixed costs. Whereas if you choose to buy from outside, it'll just add to the variable cost. And you will not have any fixed costs. And that sort of makes sense. You don't need to keep a warehouse. You just buy the thing and then you sell it on. Well, typically, why this idea of make or buy really occurs because typically that's not actually the scenario. The scenario is that we're working away, we're making our product, and then towards the end of the year, we now have an interesting scenario. We're in the middle of making our product and we run out of a component. Now, at this point, we've covered our fixed costs anyway. Right. So again, my argument here is that this type of decision as to do we buy in some components, well, again, we're through our year anyway, somewhere 3/4 way through our year. We don't need to think about our fixed costs. I mean, and I'll even explain using another method to show you anyway where I'm going with this. But the key point is that typically the make or buy principle is usually used in this second scenario where we've covered our fixed costs, we've broken even long ago. So our focus is just on the actual variable cost, which is the actual cost of making the item. In class, the last time we spoke, I said to you, really, that the cost of making something, is the variable cost. It is unfortunate we have fixed costs, but the cost of making something is the variable cost. Right? We have overheads, but the cost of making something is variable cost. It's a material cost. So if you're buying the product in, you're just buying a material. So really, we must compare like with like. Right? So the only cost we focus on when we're deciding do we make something or do we buy it in is the variable cost of us making it against the cost of buying it in. So I'll say that again. When we're deciding, do we make a product or do we buy the product in, we simply compare, if you like, the marginal cost, which is the variable cost, right? So direct materials and direct labor, and any variable overheads, if you like, if you have any. But we do not look at the fixed overheads. We don't look at this. We completely ignore our fixed overheads. And we compare that variable cost with how much we would buy it. I mean, think about it. When you're buying something, it's material. It's a variable cost. It's just a variable cost. So it'll be ridiculous to... The other reason as well is that even the idea of the fixed cost, there's no certainty. We're not quite sure what it is. If you think about it, it's an overhead. So it skews the thinking. It skews the way we even think or decide as to whether or not we should buy in. Whether or not we should buy the product in. So adding it to your variable cost only complicates matters, and this fixed overhead is usually estimated. Right? I mean, I'll just explain. Generally, when we have this idea of a fixed overhead, like light and water, we don't quite know what it is. So we have to guesstimate. So we might say something like, oh, well, we made 500 units last year, and we spent £500. So we assume that it'll be £1 a unit. So this becomes our fixed overhead. So someone says to me, how much should I make something? Someone says to you, oh, give me a quote. Well, you know this. This might be £2. Yeah, I have that. I have the material. You know how much you pay your workers? £5 an hour. So because you want to cover all your costs, because you're thinking about breaking even, you say 2 plus 5 plus 1, which gives you 8, right? So you can see this could change. This is already, we don't quite know what's going on here. This year, overheads might change. So this figure itself is already kind of, not dodgy, but confusing. So we ignore it. We ignore fixed overheads when we consider whether or not to, in short-term decision-making, right? And we compare just the variable cost of making the product with the cost of actually buying the product in. So generally, of course, the other issues that we think about when we buy a product in is, do we want to rely on another supplier? So you will need this slide very much when we're looking at, if you like, evaluation, for example. If you're trying to evaluate, even if it is cheaper sometimes to buy something in, so even if it costs you £10 to make something and it's going to cost you £7 to buy it in, the math tells you buy it in, but the argument is, can I trust the supplier? You know, what if things go wrong? What if they don't deliver on time? What about quality? Right? I mean, we buy products in all the time. You know, what about redundancies? And what about the city itself? What about employment? Should we be actually making products in-house anyway? What about identity? Right? If all your products are coming from somewhere else, what are you really doing? You're just becoming a trader. Right? And what about control? If you are allowing someone else to control your supply chain and entirely take over, and you're literally dependent on them for your product to arrive, then really who's serving who? So you might, to a certain extent, the key point is that really these are the things you need to think about. And of course, yes, I mean, if it was the other way around, well, if you're making a product in-house and it's cheaper, well, typically that is if you're making a product in-house and it's costing you, I don't know, £5 to make it in-house. It's costing you £5 to make it in-house and £7 to buy it from outside. Yes, that's the variable cost, but then you have to think, if you like, of the fixed costs as well, technically. So the key argument really here is this. Typically, the way the exam will always look, it'll always look as though it's cheaper to buy this thing in. Then you have to think of all the issues that could happen if you buy it in into your process. Will it affect anything else? Okay, right. So good. So that's what I'll do. I'll stop there. There's a second part to this, referred to as opportunity costs, and that's another cost we need to consider. But I will consider that in the next video on make or buy. Okay, great stuff. And then we'll do a question in there as well. See you in the next video.